just to check you're all happy with being recorded. If not, you might need to turn your camera off. Thank you.
Great, more people coming in.
Oh.
Great. Okay, let's get cracking then. So yeah, good afternoon, not good morning as previously stated. Thanks very much for joining us live or on catch up. We've got fantastic weather at the moment down in Cornwall. I'd imagine that many farmers and growers are busy making hay or watering market gardens, for example. But yeah, I really hope you've been able to join us via the recording. Part of the reason we decided to go for an online event was feedback was that many farmers would find it easier to catch up on the content via dial-in, either looking at recording or live from the tractor. So we hope that's enabled some more people to join us. We also welcome those dialing in from beyond Cornwall. There are a few bookings from outside the county. Frankly, it's hard to imagine there's anyone left outside Cornwall at the moment, but I'm sure there is, and your input is most welcome. So my name's Sean O'Hay. I work for the Forest for Cornwall programme. I am the Senior Programme Officer on the Managed Project Officer team. And between us, we're aiming to deliver an ambitious woodland forestry creation project in Cornwall. More about that later. I just wanted to do a brief intro to what we're hoping to achieve today. So it's the first of what we hope will be a series of events exploring the theme of agroforestry. Agroforestry is a term I've heard increasingly in discussions as I've been out and about in the countryside, and I believe there's a good reason for that. Agroforestry can potentially make a great contribution to the canopy cover that's being called for politically and within our climate aware society. It's also got the potential to deliver all of the ecosystem services that we know trees can provide: clean water, clean air, biodiversity increases, as well as obviously carbon sequestration. Soil improvement is one of the really interesting parts of agroforestry as well. So whilst it's not only maintaining the farm business, it's also got the potential to really enhance the farm business by bringing in additional produce and extra resources for the farm business. So aside from shade and shelter, so shade for livestock, shelter for crops, there's a potential for growing food produce alongside the main crop and producing wood fuel and timber products. It feels like as a community we've got a long way to go in understanding the technicalities of the subject and how it fits in with our current and future farming systems, and quite a long way to go in uptake as well. I believe it's more widely embraced on the continent, for example, but we are in a brave new world, and it does seem like there are a lot of opportunities around to make exciting things happen in on the land across Cornwall under agroforestry, though there is a potential funding gap. And the recently announced England Woodland Creation Offer doesn't exactly support agroforestry as we know it, so we've still got some work to do there in addressing any funding shortfalls. So today's all about understanding. It's about learning from the leaders in the field, and we've got some great experts on the panel today, and this will give you an opportunity to ask some questions that relate to your individual circumstances. So today's very much about a technical understanding of agroforestry and how it's practically applied on your land. Or how you can assist people to apply agroforestry technical understanding on their land. And we'd like to work through some of the barriers to the uptake of agroforestry and find some answers. So Forest for Cornwall's main role in woodland creation and tree establishment in Cornwall is to enable people to take action. So we are busy on our own assets, Cornwall Council assets, but one of our main roles is supporting and enabling. So that encompasses a very broad range of activities, of which this is one. And that's why I thought a live Q&A would be helpful, and it's a kickstarter to a series of events and discussions which can be shaped by you, the participants. So we are all ears. We do really want to absolutely address the needs people have out there and the barriers to agroforestry. So we'd like to know what do you need to progress your ambitions in agroforestry. Are farm walks, peer-to-peer learning from other farmers going to really help you? Is there any market gardening specific guidance? So a growing number of market gardens in the county, and I know agroforestry is being applied in various situations there. Do you require more information on orchards? I think of orchards as being the traditional agroforestry. It's been going on for centuries. Information on species choices, for example. Is there any need to understand the market for your agroforestry products, for example? So we really are all ears, and within reason we'll tailor our events to your needs, because we want to work with you to deliver the potential. And if we've missed anything fundamental today, please do feed that back by the means we're going to explain throughout this introduction. So I'll just share with you the agenda for the day. I think we've got a great event lined up, if I may say so. Just a moment. Okay, so here's the agenda. Let me know if you're struggling to see that particularly well. It's a bit tricky to get it right size. So a quick introduction from me, followed by an introduction from Steph Hind on the Forest of Cornwall programme, followed by an introduction and overview of agroforestry to Ben Raskin and Luke, and we'll do introductions with those people in just a moment. Looking at various different case studies. We're then going to go into a Q&A session in 2 breakout rooms. We felt with a large number of participants, it might give people more of an opportunity to raise their questions, their personal questions. And then we'll come back together and we'll provide feedback on those sessions for everyone. But both sessions are also going to be recorded, so everyone will be able to access the content. So if you're put in the Silvo pasture and you want to learn about Silvo arable as well, you can go back and watch those sessions later. And then we're going to wrap up with talk about some next steps and closing comments. So I'll introduce the participants. Stop sharing my screen there. So first of all, could I introduce Ben Raskin? Ben's from the Soil Association, and he's an agroforestry expert, and he leads the Fab Farmers Network. So Ben, could I hand over to you, please?
Hi. Yes, so this is just for the introduction at the moment, isn't it? And then
yes,
still got
yeah, just say hello.
Yeah, so yeah, hello. So yeah, I'm head of horticulture and agroforestry at the Soil Association. I was involved in editing the agroforestry handbook, which some of you may have already seen, still available to download. And I'm also project managing a 200-acre agroforestry project near Swindon. So I can talk about that a bit, although I haven't included that in the main presentation. So yeah, thanks very much for inviting me.
Great, thanks, Ben. Next, could I introduce Luke Dale-Harris, please? Luke works for FWAG and is coordinating a 12-year farmer-led silvopastoral field trial on 7 southwest farms. Luke.
Hi, everybody. So I'm a farm advisor with FWAG, the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, based in Devon, and I have put together and am coordinating this trial with a number of partners, which I'll go into in some detail in a minute. And I'm working with the Woodland Trust, doing farm design plans for agroforestry across the spectrum of arable and pastoral under that Trees for Your Farm project, which I'll also cover in a little bit of detail.
Great, thank you, Luke. I did forget the fundamental piece of housekeeping that we usually do at the top of these kind of events. Please could you mute your microphone if you're not the person talking. Lots of background noise does tend to chip away at the audible quality of this. Feel free to leave your cameras on. It's good for the presenters to see the audience reaction, as it were. Yeah, in terms of questions, feel free to use the chat quite freely. When we manage the Q&A sessions, we're probably going to rely on the chat. What we're planning to do is try and address the questions at the time, but we plan to sort of lead into a long-term follow-on via a Let's Talk platform, which we shared in the initial invite link, but we'll talk about a bit more later. And we do really hope to get to the bottom of lots of the questions you ask. So we'll cut and paste those questions into the chat and try and address them, if not today, then ongoing. Finally, in introductions, could I introduce, please, Steph Hind? So Steph is a Forest of Cornwall project officer, and Steph's done the hard work in pulling this event together. She's leading on the agroforestry side of things for the Forest of Cornwall project. Steph, if I could hand over to you, please.
Yeah, hello. I put together a bit of a presentation, so let me just share my screen. Can you see that okay? Okay, great.
Yes,
Thank
fine,
you.
Steph.
Thanks a lot. All right, well, hello, thanks very much for coming. Just a brief introduction from me about the Forest for Cornwall, who we are and what we do, in case you're not aware of the project. The Forest for Cornwall launched in December 2019 with a stated aim of a net increase in tree canopy cover of 8,000 hectares by the year 2030. So that's a total of about 2% of Cornwall's land cover as a means of contributing to our carbon neutral target. So this Cornish forest is going to be made up of all kinds of tree planting, not just one block. So we're keen to be working with people in lots of different ways to get trees in the ground. We've got, broadly speaking, two key work areas: the urban and community projects, one side, and then what's this event has come from today is the rural or delivery at scale side of the project. Our working principles in general are working in partnership with people, as Sean's already mentioned, being a facilitator to encouraging tree planting and increasing tree cover, stimulating the private sector and not displacing it, and supporting and enabling landowners and communities to get involved. So just a quick picture of who's who. We've got a full team in place now. This is us. We're broadly split, as I said, into the sort of community and urban and the planting at scale team. A lot of the staff, most of the staff from the rural side are here today. Oh, sorry, gone on too far there. Oh, what's happened? Sorry. Move on. Apologies about that. So yeah, we've got Ben Norwood here as a project officer, myself, Matt Stroud. Stu couldn't make it, but between the four of us, we've been doing a lot of the landowner visits in the landowner support team, or the planting at scale side of things. We're headed up by Sean, and Laura Jones is also here today, who's the programme lead for the Forest for Cornwall. The Forest for Cornwall is part of a DEFRA supported woodland creation partnership, which has enabled us to fund sort of posts here and grow our team to support landowners. So that's the colour scheme you're seeing. The green posts there are DEFRA funded.
Steph, sorry, your screen stopped sharing.
Oh, has it? Okay.
Yeah,
sorry.
You glitched for a moment and it went off. So
Oh dear.
You've got plenty of time, so just get yourself back online.
Yeah. I must have, my internet must have dropped out. Is that back on?
That's back on. Yep.
Right.
Thank you.
No problem. Did you see that picture? That's us. So the rural work stream, or the activity at scale that we're looking at today, is has really sort of two elements to it: planting trees on Cornwall Council's assets, so land that we own ourselves, and then encouraging planting on private land through landowner support. So the landowner support involves us being basically the main point of contact for landowners and managers who are interested in woodland creation. Our team will go out and do an initial site visit, talk to people about what they're looking to do, and do a bit of a desk exercise, looking at any designations on site, any opportunities nearby, ways that we can help support it, to come up with a sort of plan of action, and then write that up into a short report which gives a detail on the opportunities and the constraints and some funding options available, and a few pointers for taking next steps. So hopefully it helps really sort of focus people's minds about what they need to do to get these trees in the ground on their land. We will always refer to like a third party where appropriate. For example, if it's necessary to get an ecological consultant involved for a survey, or maybe some specialist advice on woodland plans or funding, we can always signpost people there. And then maybe in sort of 6 months' time, we would do some follow up and check if they need any more help or support from us. So we have been busy getting out and about. We've had about 90 inquiries from landowners so far, which has resulted in around 60 hectares of planting on private land in our pipeline. So that's sort of planned and likely to happen this current planting year in the winter. Our target that we set ourselves was 100 hectares, so we're doing quite well. And then alongside the private land, we've got extra planting on council assets, as I mentioned. So that's on county farm sites, waste sites, and other environmental service assets. The map in the background there just shows those spots are the sort of spread of inquiries that we've had from across Cornwall, and the different areas that we work to. So Ben, Matt, myself and Stu have got a different geographical area each that we work to. Help support agroforestry. So we've organised this event, as Sean explained, to just start bringing people together to learn and discuss agroforestry, and continue that afterwards through our Let's Talk platform. We'd like to be able to advise on funding. I mean, I think it's fair to say that there is currently a bit of a funding gap for agroforestry through the woodland or stewardship grants available, and we're all really waiting for a bit of clarity on what might come under the environmental land management scheme. So things are constantly changing. I think it's going to be a big part of what we do to help try and keep on top of things and filter the advice and help support wherever we can. So our role is changing all the time as a result of that. And we very much want to hear from you about how we can help. How can we help overcome some of the barriers? What training or advice or information do you need? Who can we put you in touch with? So yeah, I hope this is the start of a conversation. Specifically, though, I think there is an element of funding we can help with, as we are involved in a DEFRA funded project called the Shared Outcomes Fund. We're working with 4 local authorities on trials looking at different ways to encourage increased tree planting outside of woodlands. So down in Cornwall, we're leading on the trees on farms element of this, where we've sort of developed a trial which is looking to increase tree cover in hedges, or alongside and within hedgerows, on field corners and field margins, as well as sort of bits of infield planting. So the focus there is around practical ways to fit trees around a current farming system. But there is a more exciting sort of upcoming agroforestry element, which is relevant to today, I suppose, which we're waiting to hear for more detail, but should have soon. We will be looking for people to get involved in some social science research into the barriers of agroforestry. And also there should be some potential future funding to fund agroforestry trials. So we'll keep you posted about that. But if you're interested in finding out more about either trees on farms or the agroforestry element, let us know, just drop us a line and we can keep you posted. So that's sort of it from me. I think I've said enough for now. We're going to go to the main presenters next, as Sean explained, and then split you into your Q&A groups. Thanks just quickly from me, because I've been sort of collating your responses. Thank you to those of you who did give a preference about which room you'd like to go into. It's fair to say there's quite a lot of crossover, so it was just a way of splitting up a large group into 2 broad areas and working to Ben and Luke's strengths. But it's not a very strict boundary. You know, there's lots of crossover between silver pasture and silver arable, so they will be able to answer questions on both. So don't worry if you feel like you're missing out and not in the right room, because as Sean said, we will record them as well, so you can catch up afterwards. So I hope you find the format useful. Do get involved, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. It's really nice to see so many of you here. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Steph. That's brilliant. I did forget a key apology. Mick Bracken, the Hawkeye amongst you may have noticed that Mick Bracken was in the original agenda from the Woodland Trust. He's had to pull out due to workload, so apologies from Mick. But Luke will be picking up the content that Mick was going to share with you. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ben for an introduction to agroforestry. Thank you. Thanks,
Sean. Yeah, and thanks again for inviting me. So I've done my introduction to who I am already. So this is going to be quite a sort of whistle-stop tour. I think we're slightly behind time already, aren't we? So I probably need to sort of keep moving quickly through it. Agroforestry, just in its broadest terms, there is a lot of debate about exact definitions and whether hedges count and whether individual tree counts and that sort of thing. But broadly speaking, the way I think about it is the deliberate integration of trees and farming. So there might be lots of farmers that have trees on their farm, but if they're not really doing anything with those trees, it's probably not agroforestry. So it's about those interactions between trees and crops, or trees and animals, and using the trees in the broadest sense. And the basic concept really around why it's a good thing, if you, as most of you I'm sure know, if you look at what you see on a plant above the ground, it relates pretty directly to what's below. So if you've got a 2-inch tall grass, it's going to have about 2 inches of root underneath. So you're only using the top few inches of your soil. Once you start integrating trees into that system, you can effectively cultivate and capture some of the benefits of that deeper soil. You can use more of the free resources of water, of sun, and it's effectively, I mean, Steve Briggs calls it 3D farming. It's making better use effective of those three resources: soil, sun, and water. And as an example, I quite like this photo, which, you know, you would think if you start cultivating between trees, you're going to damage the roots. What actually seems to happen here is that it just pushes the roots further down. So you end up with potentially a similar root mass, but just lower down, and the ability to crop that top layer there, this sort of arable crop root zone as it's labeled. And there's this idea, this concept of the land equivalence ratio. So this is where this is a way of quantifying effectively the extra productivity of agroforestry systems, and it varies, you know, from farm to farm, from field to field, even depending on the crop, the soil, the climate. But effectively, as with most diverse systems, you get more than the sum of the parts effectively. So this is sort of one way of demonstrating that. So if you were growing, for instance, walnuts and wheat, you might have this sort of hypothetical target yield for walnuts and wheat if you grew them as monocrops. If you grow them mixed, you get obviously a bit less of both of them, but added together, you will get greater than 100% of each of the individual ones. And typically, agroforestry systems can be 30 or 40% more productive than a monoculture. I mean, they can be a lot more than that, and they potentially could be less. So it's very hard to say this is how much extra it will give. But typically, they're sort of at least 30% more productive. Now, obviously, you still have to use what they produce, you know, for it to be more profitable, for instance. But to give you an idea of the sort of potential increase. So as well as that productivity benefit, I just thought I'd run through quickly some of the other benefits of agroforestry. And it is worth pointing it out that you can get it wrong. You know, there is, although it's quite hard, I would say, you still need to be sort of planting the right tree in the right place and thinking about what you want from the trees on your farms. So it is worth spending a bit of time sort of thinking about what your objectives are for trees on the farm and where the potential pitfalls might be. But generally speaking, there's a whole range of things that it will do positively. So we've talked about this idea of sort of mining almost sort of the undersoil. So trees go down deeply, they pull up nutrients from lower in the soil. They obviously create carbon in their trunks and leaves. The leaves fall on the ground, increase soil organic matter, increase soil life, you know, improve infiltration, all of this sort of thing. So they're generally positive for your soil health. This is a picture, I think, in the southwest of England, actually, and it's as you might be able to recognise, it's after maize with no cover crop, and then winter flooding, and you know, that field is ending up in the river. Trees can prevent some of this happening. They, you know, you as well as that general improvement of the soil that I mentioned about and absorption, the tree roots themselves help to break up subsoils. They increase infiltration, so they can reduce the risk of flooding quite significantly. And most of you probably might have heard of the Pont Bren project in Wales, where a group of farmers introduced trees on a bit more of a landscape scale. And the studies from that showed that they resulted in 60 times less runoff on some of the slopes. So that's not 60% less, but 60 times less, which is massive, really. And when we look at what's been happening in Germany recently, you know, we need to build as much of that resilience into our systems as possible. And within that water that's running off, you get obviously not just the soil itself, but the leaching of various nutrients. And this study showed the potential of agroforestry to reduce leaching almost down to the level of forestry. Not quite, obviously, but you know, significantly less than agricultural systems. And there's similar results showing for other nutrients, phosphorus and potassium, etc. At the other end of the scale, this is not just a very out of focus photo. This is over in the east of England on a windy day, and this is fen soil being blown out of the soil and, you know, into the hedge, out into the sea probably. And planting trees helps to slow down that wind and to protect the soil. And there are a number of farmers whose, you know, one of their main motivations for planting trees has been to slow the wind down and prevent soil erosion. Most of our farmed livestock are either woodland or woodland edge creatures in origin. They like being around trees. It makes them feel safe. It makes them feel happy. I mean, in this particular instance, you can see this massive abundance of diverse things for them to eat. They provide protection from predators for smaller animals, but even cows, where you'd think, you know, they might not be afraid of things. There's studies showing that they're happier in trees, that there's more positive interactions between animals when they've got trees. And obviously, you know, it gives them shade when it's really hot. It gives them shelter when it's cold and wet. And the trees themselves can provide a part of the diet. So most animals can get quite a lot of their food from browse. Cows up to sort of 40-50%, sheep a bit more, and goats almost 95%. So there's a lot of good reasons for bringing trees into your livestock systems, as well as the sort of general animal health and welfare. In terms of crop health, again, there's a number of things that can help both the trees and the crops. So wider spacing for the trees can help the trees suffer less from disease. Better wind movement will reduce particularly fungal diseases. And on the other side, adding these diverse habitats will bring in more pollinators and predators into the system, which can help the crops in between. The crops can benefit as well from that shade and shelter that helps animals. So the temperature, for instance, between two rows of trees might be somewhere between 4, 5, even up to 10% higher than it would be on an exposed area. So you can potentially grow crops that wouldn't survive in a windy situation, or you might be able to extend the season by a week or two at each end. And some crops like lettuce, for instance, actually will grow quite happily in significant shade. So some crops might even do better under those shady parts. I mean, it is worth saying again that the interaction at the row, you know, where the crop and the trees meet, can sometimes be tricky, and in some years you might get reduced yields at the edges. Overall, the system should still be more productive. But integrating it into arable and horticulture is not quite as straightforward as integrating it into some livestock systems. The other big thing that trees will bring is resilience, and certainly this is a big reason for Helen, my boss at Eastbrook, for planting trees. So there's a systems resilience, so that's helping the system to cope better with these extremes of climate that we're getting. There's a market resilience. So the more crops you have, the more chance you've got of at least one of them succeeding every year. If you've just got one crop and it fails, you're in trouble. If you've got, you know, 15 crops, well, probably 3 of them will fail every year, but they won't be the same 3. So you should still be able to have a profitable system. And we're also looking at potentially crops that will cope if the climate changes significantly. So we're planting things like almonds and apricots and kiwis and things that are not typically grown in North Wiltshire, but who knows. So specifically, I know this will be covered probably in some detail as well in Luke's, but just to go quickly through a few of the specific benefits. Increased feed conversion rate. So if an animal is keeping warm because it's got the shade and shelter of a tree, it's going to spend less energy keeping warm. It can put that energy into putting on weight or producing more milk, for instance. One study showed a 17% increase in milk production. The shelter, particularly in spring in upland areas, can reduce lamb mortality. So there's some very specific examples of where it can increase your productivity. But even things like, if you've got areas of the farm that are a bit of a problem for fluke, where they're wet, then trees can help dry out that land, or you can, help to provide, you can fence off some of those areas to allow the trees to grow. So Pombren, I think, did some quite interesting work around that. Within the silver arable system, so I mentioned a bit about these temperature increases. The other sort of interesting bit is particularly sort of aphids, hoverflies, some of the parasitoid wasps. They really benefit from being around trees. And pretty much, I would say, every study I've read, as well as my own personal experience, is that biodiversity increases almost immediately when you start planting trees. So within 6 months of us planting trees at Eastbrook, we had, the barn owls came in, the kites, the buzzards, the kestrels. We had birds that hadn't been seen in that field for a while. We've got, orchids, so many spiders you wouldn't believe. So it's really interesting how quickly that biodiversity increases, and that will provide, again, that sort of resilience within your system. So just sort of in a way looking at the other side, what's stopping it? Because that was one of the things I know that Forests of Cornwall are interested in, is sort of finding those barriers. Fortunately, the conversation, I think, is changing very rapidly. So, I mean, I've been interested in agroforestry probably for about 10 years now. And initially, most people thought it was a bit nuts. The perception of trees on farm is that they were a problem, is that, there was no value to them. Why would you want to put more on them? I think that is still a challenge for some farmers, but I think the conversation is changing very fast. Government now is more supportive than it was. Land ownership is a challenge, particularly if you're on rented farms. It's more difficult to plant trees. But interestingly, in the last 2 weeks, we've had meetings with the Duchy of Cornwall and the Church of England, both of whom speaking very positively about encouraging tree planting on their tenants' farms, which I think wouldn't have happened probably even 5 years ago. And short-term tenancies is a problem. But I think, there's ways around that with innovative tenancy agreements and understanding the value of the trees and how that value changes over time. Skills are still a challenge. Farmers mostly don't have the skills to grow trees, either for specialist timber markets or for particular sort of nut or fruit crops. However, this does offer a massive opportunity for new entrants to come in and manage the trees, and work with farmers to create employment, to create resilience within local economies. One of the big challenges is around actually just protecting the trees once you've planted them. It's expensive, it's difficult, and it's not always what you think. So Stephen Briggs again tells this story of where he'd put rabbit netting in, but hadn't counted on when the snow came that they just climb on top of the snow and chew further up the trunk. So he had to then go back and put more netting further up the trunk. So it's things like that. We in one of our fields, we deer fenced and rabbit fenced the whole field, and for 2 years that was fine. And then the rabbits found a way in, and we had to go around and put spiral guards on all the trees after all. So it's constant. Squirrels are going to be a massive problem in a lot of areas. So don't underestimate the challenge and the cost of keeping those trees going, certainly in the early years. There is potentially a challenge with markets. So there's lots of opportunities, but there's also, there could be your on-farm market. It could be wood chip for livestock bedding, for instance, or fence posts. There's then primary crops, growing apples, nuts or something, or there's opportunities for adding value, oil from nuts or juice, for instance. So there's lots of ways of approaching that market. For some things, particularly around nuts and herbs, there's very little processing capacity in the UK. So one thing we're really keen to support is finding some cooperation and support for farmers to come together and start processing some of those products. So how do you pay for it? Well, there is increasingly support. The Woodland Trust obviously has been mentioned quite a lot, and they're traditionally been one of the few organisations that's funded agroforestry. There is now significant private funding coming in, but I heard it described recently as the Wild West of all these sort of carbon payments and what you might be locking yourself into. So I would say approach that market at the moment with care. The Woodland Carbon Code is one of the sort of few regulated bits, but doesn't always fit in with agroforestry. The government are wanting to support agroforestry now. They're very positive about it, but they're still not quite sure how to do it. And I'm particularly interested in sort of thinking about how community can support agroforestry and looking at potentially community supported agriculture and community supported agroforestry as a way of bringing groups of people together, unlocking new talent within those groups, and taking the pressure off the farmer. Just a quick conversation around the policy. So Sean, you mentioned that sort of UK was not very suitable, the England Wood Creation offer, which I think is absolutely true. It does offer some opportunity, I think, for funding smaller areas, although having looked at the application form, I was sort of slightly daunted and put off by the complicatedness of it for small areas. We're involved, along with the Organic Research Centre, the Woodland Trust and Abacus, on the Elms Agroforestry Test, which is aiming to help the DEFRA to understand how to incentivise farmers to plant agroforestry. We're sort of nearly halfway through that project. We do have a southwest cluster of farms, which is based at Dartington in Devon. So if you're interested in sort of linking up with that, then let me know. There's a group of 5 or 6 cluster farms, but we'll be holding some events and surveys and things as part of that. The other sort of potentially big development is the SFI, the Sustainable Farming Incentive standard, and in theory they're developing an agroforestry standard, which we hope will provide some of that sort of basis for support in the future. And DEFRA do have an agroforestry team, which is great. It's a very small team, as I understand it, just 2 of them, one of whom's about to go off on maternity leave. But they're knowledgeable and they're supportive and they're good. So it's worth us supporting them to help us make sure that any support is fit for purpose. In the meantime, there's lots of independent organisations that are doing stuff to help agroforestry. So I've mentioned the Woodland Trust, as have others. Obviously, the Soil Association is there. We're working, as I think was highlighted, with this Fabulous Farmers Interreg European project, and we have a Southwest Agroforestry Learning Network with a Facebook page, Agroforestry UK Facebook page, and we've got funding within that to help farmers around agroforestry. So if any of you want to follow up individually with me for a chat, or we can sort of help organise farm walks and things like that. We do have a farm walk next week at Eastbrook in Wiltshire, which I realise is quite a way for you guys, but if you don't mind the journey up, then you're very welcome. I can circulate the link to that. Farm Woodland Forum, I would highly recommend joining. They're sort of been going for decades, and there's masses of experience and knowledge within that forum. There's the Organic Research Centre, there's FarmEd, who are doing courses on agroforestry, and then a whole range of consultants like Abacus that you can sort of get individual help for. And that's me. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks ever so much, Ben. I like the balanced presentation of all the benefits that we're aware of, but there are still some barriers to navigate. And your timing was absolutely spot on. Thank you. So next up, Luke's going to give us an introduction to the FWAG agroforestry trials. So I'll hand straight over to Luke. Thank you.
Right, hello everyone. I'm going to share my screen and hope that works okay. Has everyone got this picture up on their screen? So I'm going to assume that's a yes. So I'm involved with what we're calling the Devon Silver Pasture Trial, which is a collaboration between FWAG, Southwest, innovative farmers who are helping fund us, who are also brought in the Organic Research Centre, so Lindsay Wistons, who Ben mentioned, who's an animal behaviour specialist, focusing on silver pasture particularly. And then Rotham Said Research, specifically North Wick, up by Oakhampton, who many of you might know, and the Woodland Trust. So it's quite a large, well-formed partnership with lots of different areas of expertise brought into it. So we've got 8 farms involved, and they're spread across North Devon. So this here is Dartmoor, and most of them are up here in the kind of on the border between the Redlands, where the majority of the dairy farms and arable farms of this part of Devon are concentrated, and over into the wilder west of northwest Devon, which often gets left out of these kind of conversations. So it's nice to be working there. And the farms are a mix of, they're quite well spread across the main farm types of this area. So mixed beef, sheep, arable, and some dairy as well. And they're split evenly between organic and conventional. And altogether, they've planted around 120 acres of agroforestry. So the first thing we did was the trials. It's farmer-led. That was the basis of our research, was to take cues from the farmers as to what we're going to look at. And so we put some questionnaires out to the farmers to try and get an idea of what challenges they faced on their farm. We split them down between environmental and animal behavioural, but of course there's some interrelation between all of these different things, so it's not a clear-cut division. And we asked them to grade or to rank the order of priority for a variety of different metrics. And it came out looking something like this. So the priorities within the environmental category were pretty evenly split. So biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and hydrology, meaning water retention and flood mitigation, were all equal. And then soil biology came out a little lower, although I think that is shifting slightly over time as more farmers get interested in the interrelation between trees and mycorrhiza in particular, and how that can impact on grass and crop growth. And then for animal behaviour, shelter, and that's meaning against both winds and rain, came out at the top, and shade marginally second. I think most farmers that we've come into contact with in this respect understand the benefit that trees can bring, and that was shade and shelter. It's quite an obvious one. Farmers look at their animals out on a day like today and see them heading to the hedges, stopping grazing, seeking out the little bits of shade that they can find, and then knackering the ground beneath them, so you get these bare patches of soil which don't grow back very well. Shortly after that was nutrition. So there's not a lot of understanding popularly about the impact that trees can have on animal nutrition. And this is something that Lindsay Wistons specialises in. So she's leading on this area of research. So the particular interest there is on how trees can mobilise minerals that might be missing within the fodder and the forage, but that farms are having to bolus for or supplement in one way or another. So we're looking at how those minerals can be mobilised from deeper within the soil profile and made available to animals through the leaf ground. And natural medication slightly falls under that category, but goes beyond. So farmers were interested in looking at the impact that different trees could have on specific illnesses within their livestock. So things like the beneficial effect of willow as a natural source of salicylic acid was a pain relief, and the anthelmintic properties that a number of different trees have. So that came up relatively important, and further behind was the idea of conserving fodder, so making tree hay and tree silage, which I think a lot of farmers that we've talked to just think sounds like quite a lot of fat. But we can come back to that. So effectively, what we've done is taken many of the things that Ben noted, many of the different beneficial effects that silvopasture can bring, and we're trying to drill down onto some of the hard data around those, which on a global level is often available, but it's very geographically specific. And so we're trying to work out the relevance to the UK. That research is split quite evenly across the different partners, but with Rothamsted taking a major role in the environmental and below ground soil research. So we offered farmers 3 different planting designs and a set planting density. And there's something a little artificial about this and a bit awkward to implement, but for the sake of consistency within the trial and reducing the amount of variables within the research, it was a necessary thing to do. And we were nervous about it to begin with, but in reality, we found that there's some fundamental limitations to what you can do within agroforestry or silvopasture particularly. And so planting design tends to fall broadly within the 3 categories that we designed. So I'll run through them quickly now, and then we're going to give a couple of case studies later, which we'll go into a bit more detail. This one, regular spacing, is in the name. So it's regular spacing between trees. But in the picture, in the schematic you can see here, pretty poorly illustrates what it looks like on the ground, because in most cases, farmers want alley planting, so rows of trees in lines, and then a workable space between each row of trees that can either be used for mob grazing between, so putting electric fences between each line of trees and moving animals across day by day, or can be cropped in between as well. So for those farmers on a mixed rotation, it's still compatible with that approach. So we went tree, shrub, tree, shrub, tree, shrub. And I'll go into more detail on the species at the end of this. But the idea there is that the trees will grow up to be canopy trees that will provide shade and shelter, while the shrubs will be managed on some form of rotation to keep them at browse height. Because obviously as a tree grows, it sheds its lower branches and you lose the majority of the browse availability for the animals. So it's a way of trying to reconcile those 2 services. Around each tree, we have planted 3 hawthorns in a kind of nest or nursery. The idea being that will provide some protection for the tree against the rubbing animals once they grow, which is one of the major questions around this as to how we know that to get a tree above browse height so that the animals don't eat off the leader shoot and jeopardize its growth is a matter of waiting. So we're assuming 5, 6, 7 years, maybe more on certain more exposed or shallow soiled sites. But there's a lengthy time beyond that when the trees can potentially still be at risk of being broken, snapped, damaged by animals rubbing against them. So the idea of the hawthorn is it will act as a protection against that. The next one is, we've called it shelter belts here, which is not a very good term. And so we're backtracking rapidly to try and call it green barns or living barns. The idea being that these are spaces within each parcel that the animals can go into, they can get shade and shelter, they can access browse, and it provides the additional service of shelter across the parcel. So we've set a we set a planting density of 200 trees per hectare across the trial, and that's the same for this one, but all those 200 trees are concentrated to within 20% of the hectare. So you have a belt along the side of each field, or you break fields up with multiple belts, which then provides shelter across, browse and shade within. So the final one is, we're calling it cluster planting, or just, again, the name changes day by day. And this is effectively designed to mimic natural succession in one way or another. So we're looking at groups of standard trees, so things like oak, downy birch, field maple, surrounded by clusters of shrubs. So the illustration on the right probably shows it better. So you have this area of trees and then little kind of shoals almost of shrubs going around the edge, so the animals can move in and amongst it. And it maybe makes up 20-30% of the field in total, and then you have this open pasture within. So it's less compatible with a more kind of conventional productive grazing or cropping system, but it does create something which forms a balance between agroforestry, forestry and farming. And it looks lovely. So these are the trees, very quick run through. We chose them for benefits, the diverse range of benefits. So the shrubs we chose for nutritional qualities primarily, while the standards was about looking at the type of shade they can give, the way that the leaves break down. So certain trees like sycamore we were cautious about because the leaves will break down slower and so they can form a mat on the ground. But the primary kind of driving force behind it was to choose trees that were compatible within the landscape. So trees that were already found within the area, so we had some connectivity and we weren't just creating fields that were effectively kind of two monocultures, one above the other, but were a fluid extension of the natural system. So the last bit before we go on to some case studies is about protection. I'm not going to go into much detail on this because I think it might come up in the question and answers, but we've been playing around with different ideas. So things like cactus guards, which are metal guards that with parts of the metal bent outwards to act as deterrents for rubbing livestock, hopefully not something to attract them to it. And then we've used 1.8 meter guards to protect against red deer, and we've played around with this idea of hawthorn as a mantle. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a case study, but before I do so, I want to make sure that everyone can hear me okay. Yeah? Excellent. Right, so the first case study to look at is the farm by Black Dog in North Devon. It's on the edge of the dairy land, so it's where the land gets heavier and slightly less productive, and the farming shifts over to beef and sheep in general. And it's run by a farmer called Hen Curtis, who's organic, and she runs her beef and sheep across 250 acres. It is mixed, so she grows some cereals for human consumption. The livestock are shifting to a 100% pasture-fed diet, so she's effectively separating those two enterprises, the arable and the livestock. And so within that arable rotation, she's following the cereals with herbal lays. So she has a mixture of permanent pasture and herbal lays. And she has a relatively loose grading rotation at the moment, but she's tightening it as she goes. So she's looking to move towards a kind of moving the animals every 1, 2, or 3 days, and leaving longer rotations, longer breaks before returning animals to the same paddocks. So this is a kind of overview of her farm. Most of what you can see in that image is hens. And she's taken 3 plots, and she's actually planted each one of the different planting designs that I just went through. So over here you have the regular spacing, here you have the cluster planting, and up here you've got a 10-acre field that she's split into. Sorry, I'm pointing on the wrong screen. So again, this one's regular spacing, this one's cluster planting, and up here is shelter belts. And the idea there is partly dictated by the landscape. So this field is quite wet, quite rushy, with some quite minor but still relatively important species, grassland species diversity within this wet patch here. So she wanted to build clusters that could support that rather than flatten out or overshade that botanical value in the ground. Over here, she has some woodland that she's planted over the last 5 years, about 4 hectares that spreads across there, and she wanted some regular spacing that could extend it while providing slightly different habitat and also be compatible with that bit of productive grazing she has. Then up here, the one we'll look at in a bit of detail, this is a 10-acre field that is in rotation. So it just came out of oats last year and went back into grass. And Hen wanted to break it up into 1 hectare paddocks, or slightly less, so that she could graze them on a cell grazing system, so moving the animals day by day. And she wanted to break those up with shelter belts so that there was some shade and shelter for the animals, and also some diversity within the fodder. This is actually a slightly flawed diagram, but because the primary wind is westerly coming in from this direction, this all shifts over a bit, so there's a belt there. She's used belts. The way she's designed the belt is to have the standard trees running down the center with a line of oaks flanked by a line of what we're calling minor broadleaves, so things like birch and field maple and alder. And then outside that is clusters of shrubs. So again, the animals can come in, they'll browse the shrubs on the outside and then slowly enter into the main shelter or shaded part, which the oaks will play. It's planted, the belts are planted at kind of standard woodlands, or slightly lower than standard woodlands creation density. So 1,000 trees per hectare within the blocks. The assumption is that will hamper grass growth, but that's inherent within the design. So where regular spacing is looking to be compatible with continued productive grass growth and will be thinned accordingly, and that's something we're monitoring as time goes on, at what point the grass growth starts to be impeded by the canopy closure. Within these belts, we're assuming grass will fall out and that the agricultural benefits brought by the belts will be more holistic, so will be implicit within the wider farming system. And as Ben said, there's some good research on the decrease in things like lamb mortality, where there is access to proper shelter through the winter, and good evidence of increase in productivity and yields on a daily live weight basis rather than a fodder growth basis, where animals have access to shade in the summer. So what we'll be looking at here is how she's taken out 20% of the parcel to plant up, but we'll be monitoring different metrics of livestock performance and health and welfare across that same field to see whether it balances out or whether she is going to have to drop her stocking density, livestock stocking density a bit. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Ben to do the next case study and then come back with the third one.
Thanks, Luke. Really feels like a trip to Devon's going to be in order fairly soon. Okay, Ben, you all set?
Yes, and sticking in Devon. So yeah, moving on to the horticultural case study. There's a few quite good horticultural case studies. some up near me, but I chose this one because I felt it was probably most similar to the challenges that growers in Cornwall would face. So this is Martin Bragg at Shillingford Organics. The farm itself is 170 acres, mixed farm. He runs a vegetable box scheme from the for the farm and has a biomass boiler. And his main challenges on the farm, so in terms of the trees, were strong winds and some soil erosion on sloped fields, particularly where growing crops that needed winter harvesting. Oh, hang on, not moving forward. There we go. So he chose, particularly chose to, because he had this box scheme that he was running, he chose mainly fruit and nut trees, which would give some additional cash crop into the box scheme, but also was interested in growing some of his own wood fuel. His main lessons that he learned from this first planting that he did were that the trees were planted too close. So he had some problems in terms of machinery. So again, obviously, when you're cropping, and particularly anything where you're using any tractors at all, which is probably most systems of any size, you need to adapt your system to that machinery. And for that reason, most horticulture and arable systems will be straight lines and alley cropping. I mean, there's no reason apart from efficiency that you can't plant clumps of trees, but mostly that isn't practical. So most of these systems you'll see are straight lines, and often single row or double row trees to ensure access to the trees as well, although that depends obviously a little bit on what you're using the trees for. The other thing he found with some of the trees was that they actually just grew out too much and shaded the crops too much. So when he took, I mean, he still, despite those lessons that he learned, he was still convinced of the benefits of the trees and not only the market for the fruit, but the benefits to the crops that he was growing in between. So in 2014, again with the help of the Woodland Trust, he did a second planting, a lot of fruit still, so apple, pear, mulberry, with some hazel and alder and willow for the biomass boiler. So he planted another 8 acres, and this time he put a much wider spacing. So he had a 4-meter row in which the trees were planted. And again, there's lots of debate about the width of the row. So there's the challenge of how big the tree is going to grow. So that will depend on obviously the size of the tree and the rootstock and things like that. There's also a question about what you're growing in between it. So at Dartington, they've got elderflowers and they've also got apples, and they've got a slightly different system because the elderflowers need to be grown, need to be harvested earlier when there's still a crop in the ground. So they've left a wider strip for the elderflowers, whereas they've chosen late cropping apples, which means they can go in after the arable crop has come out, so they can leave narrower spacing and a narrower strip for the trees with the apples. So those are some of the considerations to think about. But Martin ended up now going with a 4-meter width, so that enables him to mostly be able to sort of drive up and down, certainly in the early years with those trees. 28 meters between the rows, so that gives him effectively a 24-meter alley for the vegetables. And the advantage of 24 meters, which is the same width we've gone for in our alleys at Eastbrook, is that it's divisible by 12, 8, 6, 4, 3 and 2, which effectively means you can use pretty much any piece of machinery between those rows. So that's worth thinking about as well. You know, what machinery have you got, what spacing you're going to need, and making sure that you leave big enough headways at the end to turn that machinery around, particularly if you've got biggish kit. And I mean, this is a very brief case study, which probably is a good thing if we're tight on time. So the benefits that Martin has seen from these trees, obviously the fruit crops bring additional income. He's improved his soil structure. He's seen a reduction in the erosion. He's provided shelter, which brings on the early crops, so that temperature difference and extension of season that I mentioned earlier. And he's also seen a reduction in the effects of drought, which you might think is slightly counterintuitive. You might think, oh, the trees are going to be sucking up all that water. But actually in really hot weather, the only thing that grows is the stuff that's in the shade of the trees. And certainly we saw that in 2018 when we had that long drought. The only green grass in our pastures was under the trees. He's seen an improvement in pest management through the pollinators that the trees have provided. I mean, I don't know if he's quantified this, but he says that he's seen increased nutrients in the soil. And then obviously he's reduced his energy bills by using the wood as well. So those are, and with horticulture, it's, in a way, it's, although implementing it is more complicated, deciding what to do is potentially simpler. You have a row and you have to fit the system within the row. So depending on whether you're looking to grow fruit and nut crops, or whether you're growing short rotation coppice for wood chip or growing timber, it's relatively easy to work out how big those trees are going to go, and therefore the spacing that you might need to ensure you can still grow crops in between. And the one final thing, I guess, is just to think about whether this is a permanent agroforestry system or a temporary agroforestry system that will lead to a forestry system. So some of the arable and horticultural systems in France, for instance, they see it as a temporary system as they move from agriculture into forestry. So they would plant their trees a bit closer, and they might only expect to get a wheat yield, for instance, for the first 10 years of that, or the 15 years until the canopy closes over. So that's one other thing to think about is, is it a way to maintain an income as the forest or the timber develops, or is it something that you want to effectively carry on cropping with both trees and crops effectively indefinitely? So that's all I've got on the horticulture.
Thank you, Ben. Do you know if there's any yield information about the fruit and nuts?
I couldn't find any, if I'm honest, and I don't know, because I think when he first planted it, he wasn't really thinking it as an agroforestry system. He was just thinking, I'm going to plant some trees, and so I don't think he monitored it particularly closely. And I think that's a challenge with actually quite a lot of the horticultural systems or the arable system. We don't. So Stephen Briggs has got more measurements with his wheat and apple system, but I think mostly the evidence for UK sort of financial and yield things is quite scarce still, and it's something that we'd love to see more of. More detail. I know it's one of the barriers for farmers thinking of getting into it is really understanding, what that financial model will be. I mean, they're aware that it's going to be an investment in the trees, but understanding what the interaction between a particular crop or a particular tree is tricky, and we don't have good UK evidence yet for a lot of these. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Apologies, I abused my position as chair to ask a question. Now I'm sure everyone's dying to ask loads of questions. I'll sit on my hands and hand back to Luke for one more case study before we go to Q&As.
Okay. Here's a good question though, so to just keep going on it for a second before we move on. For pasture, it's something that we're looking at, and a lot of what we've heard about silvopasture from abroad is that it will increase your grass growth in lots of different conditions. And like Ben said, that's certainly true in long droughts. That's pretty verifiable anecdotally. But the primary limiting factor for grass growth in the UK is still light availability. And so the key question is, what density do you plant trees at, and how do you thin them out appropriately to keep that productivity going? And for the shrubs, there's this additional question of how you keep them at browse height, because they're going to do their best to stop being browsable and grow. A shrub is just a tree that, well, this isn't quite as simple as that, but most of them will grow into canopy trees, so hazel and thorns and willows, and we're using elm as shrubs as well. They will grow up And so realistically, we're probably looking at coppice rotations, which then brings in that additional question of how to use that wood. So what markets are up for that? So nothing simple. Right, so this is Lower Withycombe Farm, which is on the edge of Dartmoor. That in the background over there is Chagford, for anyone who knows the area.
Sorry, Luke, we're not seeing your shared screen at the moment.
Okay, hold on. You got it?
That's better, thank you. Yep.
Yep, so that's Chagford in the background, and this is me over there. That's Morton Hampstead, where I'm sitting, and so it's within the Dartmoor National Park, which makes things slightly trickier. As we're being in an AONB, there's certain rules around tree planting and what you can and can't do. So we had to bear that in mind. So Seb, it's run by a guy called Seb Powell, who started a dairy farm about 4 years ago, over 100 acres, and he will be expanding that to a couple of hundred over the coming years as that land becomes available from his landlord. It's thin land. I mean, it's Dartmoor land, so it's acidic, thin soils, free draining, and loamy, but relatively unproductive, especially on the slopes. So he runs Jersey cows across it on a mob grazing system, and produces dairy of 100% pasture fed with some whole crop as an addition. And he wanted to look at silvo pasture as a means of providing shade and shelter. Specifically shelter. Go back a bit. So this is the field. And Dartmoor is just off the edge of the map, the moor starts. And the westerly winds in winter and summer and spring run through here, and this side of the farm really gets a battering. So in another situation, your best bet might be to look at shelter belts down the edges of fields. But what Seb wanted to do was something that was fitted into this landscape. And so running down from that yellow field, you've got an area of relatively scrubby, quite species-rich grasslands that is kind of sort of rewilding, and has a lot of habitat value. And it runs all the way down here, and he's looking to try and restore the culm grassland or roast pasture, the wetland, acid wet grassland species of this kind of area. And then that runs down to here as well, which is also species-rich. And the Team Valley is there. And historically, all of this was arable. For some bizarre reason, people tend to plough this part of Dartmoor up. And so there was a lot of runoff that came down and went into the Team. That's mostly finished. But there's still quite thin soils, and there's still the risk of nutrient runoff. So he's looking at a way to break this field down into something that hovered between pasture and woodland. And so the obvious choice within the context was to go for this open grazed wood pasture kind of cluster planting design. And it's 10 hectares, so it's quite a hit on a 100-acre farm. I said 10 hectares, 10 acres, so 10% of the farm will be planted up. And over the course of the establishment of that pasture, he's going to have to leave it fallow. He's not going to be able to graze it without risking damaging the trees and almost definitely damaging the shrubs. The shrubs are protected by 75 centimetre spirals, and the trees are 1.8 metre guards. So the chances are the animals will just browse off all the shrubs at their nascent stage and kill them, or at least bonsai them. And the 1.8 metre guards, they'll push over, and they just cause too much damage to be justifiable. So he's taken the whole field out of production, and he's waiting 5 years. And we've got to keep a real eye on what happens to the sward in that time. And we're already seeing the nature value of it go through the roof. And like Ben said before, in these early stages of planting, and just to be clear, all the trees went in March. I haven't said this. So across the whole trial, they went in March this year, so it's early stages. And within the first 6 months, you do already start to see the raptors coming in to predate on the mice and voles that are drawn to the tusky grasslands, an increase in pollinator numbers. And that will only keep going. And then it will shift as the trees begin to mature and you get a different type of habitat. But there's a risk that the grass becomes kind of irredeemable. So through that establishment phase, you have to look at irredeemable is too strong a word, but it becomes hard to bring back to productive grassland. So it might be that sheep are put on very short bursts of grazing to help fight back the brambles, or that he tops it in a kind of dizzying motion by going around all the different clusters, or even cuts it for hay. But that's something we've got to work out, and it's definitely something that puts many farmers off doing anything like this. But it's a shame, because Seb's idea is that once this is developed, he will have a field that has shifted from 100% open pasture with many disbenefits to that, to being something that is a much more fluid kind of in between that. So there will be probably 25% canopy cover and 75% grasslands once this has grown up. And it will look the idea is it will look something like much of Britain looked before, in the kind of early medieval times, before woodland started being separated off from arable and grassland. And that the animals will have a very happy time. And the immediate comparison is neck. But we're hoping that it can veer slightly more to the agricultural side than neck does, and be managed at a slightly higher level of production. All of this is hypothetical, unfortunately, because it's so early days. But the plan is that this will be an important part of their winter grazing platform. So the animals are outwintered, and that when the land is dry enough, they can be put in there. And because it's free draining, it does remain dry throughout much of the winter until it gets really wet. And that in that situation, it will provide the shade and shelter the animals need. So we've chosen some shrubs that are evergreen and trees. We've put some Scots pine in there and holly. And the shrubs will be planted densely enough, so even once their leaves have fallen, they should provide a decent degree of shelter in the winter months. It's also an interesting field because it's on a hill and the soils are so thin, it does burn off really quickly. So part of the experiment is looking at how the trees influence that, and how far that influence extends beyond the area of the trees into the open pasture. So what soil changes happen that produce a tangible and verifiable effect on the grass growth in the open area. So lots to come on, but we're not there yet. Okay, so that's the end of that one. I'm sure there's lots of bits that I haven't covered, so hopefully they can come up in the question and answers.
Thanks, Luke. Yeah, as you say, lots to still understand about it, and very early days. I think the tree protection from the livestock and silvopasture systems seems to be one of the big issues, doesn't it? And I know and we've just very early stages of experimenting with a thorn is mother of the oak thing, where we plant an oak in the middle of a ring of hawthorn. So lots going on, lots to understand. And I know James Daniel, who has the consultancy Precision Grazing, I don't think he's with us. He did join the invite, so hopefully you'll see the recording. Hi, James. Has talked about working with the No Fence system, the Norwegian GPS-based fence system, and I know Cornwall Wildlife Trust have been experimenting with that down west, so that is in the county. So that could be a good follow-up event, actually, trying to understand the different tree protection to maintain the pasture benefits whilst the trees are establishing. But yeah, it's a big subject, isn't it? Okay, we are running behind time. That's not too much of a problem, because the wrap-up section, we've got 10 minutes. It will take me a couple of minutes, so we're not going to be too far over. But moving on anyway, we're into the Q&A session. So Steph is going to do some whiz-bottery and send us all into 2 different chat rooms for 20 minutes, and then we'll be automatically brought back here to reconvene after that time. If you want to leave the entire thing, please by all means press leave, but don't press leave to leave the chat room, because you will leave the whole call and we'll have to dial back in. Not the end of the world, but I suggest initially we'll start off with a nominal 2 minutes per question in each chat room, and then if we find that we've got plenty of time left, we can obviously indulge people with more time, but just to make it fair, to give everyone an opportunity. And I suggest putting questions when we're in the chat rooms, putting questions in the chat just to keep a list. But if you're really struggling with that, please do put your hand up, because we can put your virtual hand up via the button on Teams and we can pick you up then. Steph, do you have anything more to add on the breakout room side of things?
Only that one person on the call's joined via their phone. Sorry, I haven't got a name for you, but so I'm actually going to just set up one breakout room, because I can't put people on phones in breakout rooms. So half of you, the Silvo Pasture lot, are going to go off into a room, and this main meeting will be for Silvo Arable. So nothing much changes, but I'll open that room now. Okay, thanks. Where we cross our fingers for technology to be on our side.
10-second countdown, it's looking good.
Oh, good, all right, see you later. I'll give you a warning before it closes.
Okay, it seems like the chat's
Thanks,
worked.
Ben. Lovely.
Okay.
Ben's sort of attempt to facilitate, and I hope that we've got who we've got here. Let's see. Oh yes, Ben Raskin. Sorry, 2 Bens in charge now.
Yeah,
Hi,
make
Steph.
it easy to remember.
Hello, Charlotte.
Can you pop me into the Silver Pasture one, please?
Oh, okay. Yes.
Thank you.
No problem. Sorry,
Okay,
Charlotte.
so if you have any,
any.
okay, if you have any questions, then if you can pop them in the chat, and then I'll try and pitch them to Ben. And if you're not getting to grips with the chat, please raise your hand, and I'll try and remember an order of which they arrive in. Okay, and if you're not speaking, if you can just remember to keep your mic muted. So, anybody got any questions for Ben on civil horticultural regimes or civil arable? And likewise, if you don't end up getting to the pasture one, Ben will be able to field some general questions, and then we can always pitch them to the wider group later on, as we'll be capturing any questions and summing up later as well. So Charlotte has asked about ideas for smaller horticultural systems for less than 2 hectares.
So yeah, and I mean, I would just say, looking around, there's some faces around that know quite a lot of stuff as well. So I'm certainly not the only person on this call that knows things. So it might be worth just making sure that other people answer as well. But anyway, so yeah, in terms of smaller systems, I guess it's about the size of the tree as much as anything. So trained fruit trees are quite good. You can effectively make them any size you want. A colleague saw in Italy a field of broad beans that was split up across many acres by just a single step over apple tree at about 2 feet off the ground, running up. So just a little strip effectively. So you can mix in almost any way. I'd avoid big trees, basically, is what I'd say. But you can either coppice things like hazel, willow, or you can even coppice fruit trees. I haven't done quite as many experiments as I want on coppicing fruit trees, but you might not get maximum yield, but if they're easy to manage, because all you've got to do is go in and sort of cut them back every 3 or 4 years, then it might make it, you might gain from the reduced cost of management what you would lose in
Charlotte asked to move, and I asked to move.
in yield. But yeah, I'd say that's the main thing really. It's just about managing. It's because it's all about the sort of height of the tree versus the space of the row, effectively. Alan Schofield, who was previous chair of the Organic Growers Alliance, had a really nice 30-year-old agroforestry system up in Lancashire, which was pollarded alder. And he had a 5-year rotation on it. So he pollarded them every 5 years. And he had, in the end, I need to get it out of his brain actually, because I never wrote it down, but he had quite a complicated rotation because he'd worked out which crops did well in which phase of the pollarding. And not only that, but which ones did well in the middle of the row and which ones did better in the, nearer the trees. So, as I was saying before, lettuces actually can cope with quite a bit of shade. So they went in right at the end of the rotation, whereas the stuff that needed full sun went in just after the pollard. So yeah, so you can definitely do it. It's just about keeping the trees in control, I would say.
So relative sizes. Okay, thank you for your question, Charlotte. Patrick, I believe you've had your hand up for a while. So do you want to ask your question?
Thank you, Ben. Thanks to all the presenters. I found that really fascinating, and I think there's some really interesting suggestions. What really worries me is if we are to persuade farmers in numbers to look at this as an option on their farm, is the lack of evidence to support that, because they will need to understand what impact a project of this type will have on their gross margins and on the farm business. As we all know, support for farming is changing. It potentially has a very bright prospect, but it also has the potential to be a complete car crash, depending on where current government policy ends up. I'm not sure even they understand that. So I am a bit disappointed that we don't seem to have that evidence in order to put in front of people when they are hopefully looking at options going forward. And I just wonder whether, is that not there? And if it is there, how can we collate it and put it together?
I think it's a bit of both. I think there's evidence from elsewhere, some of which is fairly translatable to a UK system and some of which isn't at all. I think that there is more evidence in the UK that hasn't been properly sort of collected or collated, but there's no question that there's a lot of it that isn't there at all, that needs more investment in research. And I think what we'll, I agree with you, I think it's a problem. I think what we'll see is in systems, some such, like Luke was outlining, with livestock, it's actually pretty much a no-brainer in a lot of situations and quite easy to implement. I think we'll see quite a lot of that being adopted. I think the uptake in cropping systems will be slower. I think, the fact that we do have some quite good examples that are starting to become a bit more mature, like Stephen Briggs, like the one I outlined, like in Tolhurst in Berkshire, there's one at the Duchy farm in Gloucestershire. So there are some systems now that are a bit more established that even if the data's not there, you can go and see, and you can look at the impact, so even if it's not telling you everything, it might tell you enough for those more innovative farmers to take a punt. But I think until we have better evidence, I think you're absolutely right. I think the uptake in cropping systems will be slower than it should be.
Thank you.
Okay. And this ties in quite nicely with our next question from Lucas. Do you have any recommendations for market research for short-term coppicing trees in shelter belt plantings? So I suppose it's looking for that evidence base and what they can support for the business case.
Yes, I think, on the short rotation coppicing and hedgerows, there's a bit more evidence, and it's partly about market, and it's partly about the ease of harvest. So the Organic Research Centre did some really good stuff on hedges and hedgerow management, and on changing from flailing, for instance, over to a coppicing cycle and what that might yield. And you can link that, if you're selling wood chip, for instance, or the wood fuel for biomass. There's some some costings around that. There's HedgeLink UK with Robert Walton and others have done some really good costing stuff on that. So I think there's more financial evidence on that. I think there's still work to be done in things of carbon sequestration of different systems and things like that. If we're starting to be paid for public goods, or the benefits, for instance, of changing your management system on biodiversity. If you want to be paid for biodiversity, what is the increased benefit from an annual flaying to a 3-year flaying, or a 5-year coppicing or 10-year coppicing? So some of those different systems. I mean, the other bit that I'm really interested in is around sort of using wood chip for soil health and Ramiel wood chip. So that's another area. There's only been a couple of research that looking at that, one by the Organic Research Centre and one about 30 years ago by Canadian scientists. But yeah.
Okay, brilliant. And then we've got a question from Abby Mansley about the sources of design advice or best practice, considering civil, arable, or other cropping regimes. So basically, where to go if they need help, really, for design.
Yeah, and I mean that goes back to the slide I showed with all the different organisations. So there's stuff like the handbook, there's stuff like the resources that came out of the Athernet and AgForward projects. So there is some stuff out there in a generic sense. There are people like FarmEd and others who are starting to run agroforestry design courses. If there's enough demand, the Soil Association can run events and courses around this as well. Or a lot of people end up paying a consultant to come and help them design. And I think one of the challenges is every farm is very different, and the objectives for every farm are different. So it's quite hard to come up with something that says, here's a design goal and plant it. You really need to look at what your crops are, what your trees might be, what your soils are like, where you're going to sell the stuff, all of that stuff. So it's, it is quite complex, and it has such profound implications on your farming business. It's long term. If you try a new annual crop and it doesn't work, you go, well, that was a failure. I'll try something else next year. If you've got your trees in and they're supposed to be there for, 20, 50, 100 years, you do really want to get it right.
Brilliant. Patrick, is that an old hand or?
No, if we got time, I was just going to try and follow up on the hedges. I mean, I think it's within an arable situation, hedges are really interesting because if we're completely honest today, hedges are a pain for an arable system. Now, I know we don't live in East Anglia, but the trouble is we don't value our boundaries. And in the Cornish Bank, Devon Bank, whatever we want to call them, we need to put some value in there. At the moment, to an arable farmer, they're a bit of a liability. Because it costs money to maintain them. What we need to be able to do is to change that and then them to be seen as an asset. Now, whether that's to the farmer, the occupier, and of course then you've got a landlord-tenant situation, or whether it's to a third party, I think is an interesting discussion. But at the moment, they are a liability. We need to change that into them becoming an opportunity and an income source. And we don't have any form of mature market for that coppicing, and somehow we have to try and develop that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I mean, I guess one opportunity is the price of timber and wood fuel going up at the moment. So that is an opportunity. And again, I think the stuff that Rob Walton did looked specifically at, how you build an independent business from managing hedgerows, and assuming that those costings are correct and relevant in all situations. He basically showed that someone could set up relatively easily with a chainsaw and a van, effectively. I mean, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but with relatively low capital investment, someone could set up a nice business managing other people's hedgerows. The problem is, certainly for some of them, is that they won't be at their most productive when you start to change the management system. So there's a challenge in that transition to getting them to be fully productive and financially profitable. But
yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your question, Patrick. Andrew, you made some interesting comments. Do you want to talk more about what you've been putting down in the chat?
I got interested in sort of biodiversity in tree crops about 2000 when I was working at Eden, so in the late 2000s, so I've been developing populations of apple trees from Cornwall, Devon and Hereford, dessert, culinary and cider, and collaborating with landowners at the moment to grow out the populations, to do assessments initially, with a view to developing proper funded projects. At the moment, there are 5 sites, 4 in Cornwall and 1 in Devon. 3 of the sites have got links to environmental or educational centres. But I'm really keen to see if there's any landowners who are into arable or vegetable production who I could collaborate with, because I think that establishment of seedling populations might be easier on arable land than on grassland. This is part of something that I want to develop, which is a sort of longer term project with participatory research with farmers, stakeholders basically, to try and select crops that are tree crops that are adapted locally. So any thoughts, comments, anyone interested? I put my email in the chat box as well. But I'm very keen, I've been going on doing it off my own back for about 10 years now. And I'm very keen to develop properly funded projects. I'm involved with the group at Castle Barton who are quite active, and we're going to meet soon. So it may be with some of the existing stakeholders that we can develop a project. But I am actually very interested if anyone's got any ideas for funding.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure Patrick's asked for you to get in contact with him. So if everybody's happy, we'll share. Patrick will give him your details. So has anybody got any more questions for Ben? Any further points or discussions they want to have on anything they've had debate? Oh, okay, Matt, you've got your hand up. Matt Healy.
Hello there. How you doing?
Hi,
I mean, you might have to excuse my ignorance on this, but I wondered if surface compaction is an issue between the rows due to the tree roots being forced to grow lower because of the traffic in between the rows. And if it is an issue, how do you manage it with in a normal grassland, for example? You can get in and use subsoilers and shakerators, but you won't want to do that if you've just planted a load of trees and you're trying to turn into a silver pasture system. So I just wondered if you could offer a bit of insight on that, please.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there probably is a risk. I think I would say you can continue to use subsoilers, and in fact some farmers do use them specifically to effectively root prune the trees. You need to do it from when they're quite young, because then you just, like that picture I showed at the beginning, you force the roots down under the crop. If you wait until they've established and then you go in, obviously, apart from the fact they might damage your machinery, you also could do the trees some damage. So you would need, it's almost like kind of training the roots down when they're young. I would say, in theory, the roots of the trees will reduce the risk of compaction because they're effectively breaking up that soil underneath and creating channels. But obviously that won't reduce the risk entirely. And for some soil types, I'd say you probably do need to be a bit careful about that and test. But I think if you do get problems, provided you've thought about it well enough in advance and have sort of managed effectively for that, if you've got a particularly prone soil, I think you can deal with it. But I think, you definitely, it is worth considering if you've got a soil that is prone to it, or a system that you're worried is going to lead to it. But yeah, good question.
It's certainly something to be wary of if you're managing land around ancient or veteran trees, which might be present in your hedgerows or within your farm landscape. You certainly wouldn't want to be doing heavy cultivation within the root protection areas, which can be quite substantial for big, mature, open-grown trees. So, yeah, definitely something to consider as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Have we got any further questions? Oh, sorry. Yeah, if you speak, I'll try and relay it.
Sorry, I'm the annoying one on the phone. I'm looking at planting a load of trees that are near the coast. What advice would you have to do with salt tolerance? What trees, and should I plant them a lot closer? It will be both for grazing animals, but also crops as well, for both uses.
Okay, so the question was around coastal exposure. Yeah, and trying to think about planting regimes that can deal with salt exposure on the winds for pastoral and other cropping systems as well. But
yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, I can't remember now which species are most salt tolerant. I mean, we're growing things like sea buckthorn and stuff, which obviously are, but they're smaller. But one of the things I would say is it's worth sort of planting almost a nurse crop of, something like alder, assuming that is salt tolerant, that grows quite quickly, and then you can plant your other stuff in the lee of that to help it establish. Or even something like sea buckthorn, which might grow quite quickly, and just provide a bit of shelter for the other trees as it establishes. But yes, off the top of my head, I don't have a list of salt tolerant trees, but it'll be out there. Someone will have done that research for sure. Are there many do you know of any trial areas where they're doing agroforestry in more maritime climates? No, not to hand. I can't think of any. Okay.
We're back, and I'm conscious of the time, so apologies for cutting people short. And there was one, maybe two questions unanswered in the silvopasture side of things, so apologies, Nick, for that. But hopefully we can follow that up via the Let's Talk platform or in, via email. So we are in touch with you, Nick. Thank you. So yeah, very briefly, a summary of the discussions in silvopasture. So we were aiming to finish at 1:45, so we'll rattle through this. Some good questions. I think the first two were challenging for Luke. Squirrels. Any thoughts about controlling squirrels as the trees mature? It's a difficult one to answer. There are traditional forestry methods of controlling squirrels, but there is anecdotal evidence that if trees are planted far enough out from the edges, the squirrels don't tend to have such an impact. But that's one to watch, one to keep an eye on. The question about to what extent the trees help water ingress to recharge the water table as opposed to preventing runoff into streams and rivers. Again, most research is about how much water is available to crop and how widely the influence of trees acts, but it is a good question, though presumably if there's water ingress increased through tree planting, then hopefully it would have a dual effect of also recharging the water table. Stocking density, a question about outwintering cattle in a forest and silvopasture system. The general rule would be nothing. However, there are nuances in that. This is a Sitka plantation, so there's not too much ground flora to damage potentially. But it very much depends on your ground conditions. If you've got heavier soil, the poaching risk could be quite substantial. So obviously that's one to judge. Yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance in that. There's a query about landscape and how agroforestry plantations could raise problems in the landscape of linear planting, square edge conifer plantations is what we'll all think of. But I'd say it's probably, good design would overcome a lot of those sorts of problems. But yeah, it's one to, I think, discuss, perhaps, especially if you're in a sensitive area like an AONB. Hopefully you'll be consulting those activities anyway and get some input from the AONB team on that in that situation. And then a comment about rather than outwintering in the woods, a dairy farmer finding that they're actually they tend to be using housing more in the summer because of the heat waves, and the dairy cattle struggling from heat stress. So how the benefits of tree planting could really be felt in that situation, which all livestock farmers will be experiencing at the moment, I'd imagine. And the outstanding question was from Nick about species choices for food and food production. But as I said, hopefully we'll come to that, be able to answer that question in another form. So Ben, are you able to give a quick summary, please?
Yeah, we had some really great questions. Some focused on the economics of hedgerow management and how they're integrated, particularly into small systems. And there was a great question around species choice for small civil arable systems under 2 hectares. And the key message there was keeping it relative. So using small tree species relative to the size of your plot, and thinking about yield versus the management challenges. Also, question around choice of species in coastal sites. There's limited evidence, but mainly trying to use the use of nurse crops to help establish your main crop trees. So it's thinking about the long-term sort of management of that. And then we had some questions around compaction in between rows, particularly in alley cropping systems, be that for silvopastoral or silvoarable methods, and how you go about potentially managing to mitigate that damage, and either use of subsoiling or existing machinery, but then being careful about the trees either in the wider landscape or needing to start that process earlier on. So essentially you root train the trees. Ben was referring to his earlier slides in his earlier presentations. And Andrew Ormerond was then in the discussion about looking for trial sites, about trying to test different systems. Yeah, that's about us.
Great, thanks Ben. Sounds like some really good discussions. I mean, I got the sense that we could have nattered on for quite a lot longer. I don't know about the silvo-arable side of things. I'd imagine so. Just out of interest, a show of hands, do you think more time just sort of exploring each of those issues in a more informal setting would be helpful? If you can stick your hand up, certainly 1 there, 2. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, a lot of unfinished discussions. Yeah, lots of hands flying up. So yeah. Well, that's good to know. I think, as I said, this is hopefully a Kickstarter for an ongoing engagement, bringing people together to talk these things through, rather than being isolated. We can all work through the hive mind, as it were. So just conscious of the time, just to round up, really. So I think, there does seem to be a lot going on. From what I gather, there seem to be a lot of projects in planning in Cornwall, and it's certainly amazing to hear about the trials going on in Devon particularly, and not too far away for future potential visits. But I think we've looked at the benefits of trees in the farm landscape in a agroforestry setting for wildlife. Talk about raptors coming in very quickly once the trees are planted, surprisingly quickly by the sounds of things. We've seen an example where someone has seen the benefits of produce to go alongside their veg boxes in Devon. That's amazing. It never ceases to amaze me how quickly apple trees can become productive, to a certain extent. Obviously, the talk about healthy livestock, welfare issues, so cell grazing, mob grazing. If you're putting livestock in a field with those sort of systems, then they can be well away from the hedgerows and potentially not able to express their freedom to go and find shade and shelter. So integrating trees into a cell grazing system, for example, seems to me like common sense if it can be navigated and set up. obviously looking to the concerns about tree protection, but I think there's some discussions to have around that. And obviously, you know, as soon as we've got trees growing, we're really starting to store away some carbon and addressing the climate emergency. So huge amount of excitement and positive issues to talk about. There are obviously some boundaries, you know, how does it in practice work for a wide range of farmers? Is it really going to start, you know, having a negative impact on some of the core farm business in some situations? Hopefully we'll get to those answers. So I'll just draw your attention back to Let's Talk. So Let's Talk's the Cornwall Council consultation platform. It does provide us the ability to provide more flexibility and engagement than the core Cornwall Council website. So it's a great opportunity to get people together. So the link would have come through in the invitation. If anyone's struggling to find the link, please let us know and we can share it. But otherwise, if you go on Let's Talk Cornwall and search agroforestry, you'll be asked to sign in, and that will address the GDPR issues, which are something we have to be very mindful of. And you will then be able to access the forum, so you can put any subsequent questions up there. We will attempt to post the questions from the Q&A in there as well, and any summaries of answers. But you please just, you know, go for it. If you have an outstanding question, something comes up, or you want to continue discussion on the forum, that's what it's there for, and it'd be great to see it used. There's a survey. We'd really like to know what's going on in Cornwall, which, you know, it does ask a series of questions just to understand where you are with agroforestry and where you'd like to be, and perhaps how Forest for Cornwall can help to enable that. And there's also a map, which is a really good visual guide to what's going on. So you can very quickly and simply drop a pin on your land holding, saying what you are doing and what you'd like to do with agroforestry and what sort of agroforestry it is, whether it's silver pasture, silver arable, wood fuel and wood produce, or orchards. And there's also, we're going to hopefully put more resources up there. So I know Patrick shared an interesting paper from the Organic Research Centre. We can put links like that up there, which will be hopefully act as a resource for people. And as new papers come online, we can hopefully post them up there. So please share the forum. It doesn't have to be exclusive to people who attended this thing today. Please share it with all your peers and anyone you think might be interested. And they will also be able to see a recording of this event. So lots more to come from Forest for Cornwall in general, not just on agroforestry. Best way to keep in touch with that is to sign up to our newsletter. And if you go on the Cornwall Council website, you can follow a link to subscribe to our newsletter. But you can also find the Contact Us form where you can ask us any questions about support you might need. You can engage with our team who are available to come out and provide initial support and guidance for your farm-based, land-based woodland schemes. Anything you're thinking about, we can help you shape those. And the main point for us is we'll take you to a certain point and then signpost you to sources of funding, sources of further support. I think just to wrap up, you know, land is under increasing pressure. Just said today that the house prices are at an all-time high, slightly eye-watering. And you know, our land's under increasing pressure for development. Ironically, we might well be under pressure in future for carbon offsetting projects. You know, so people are going to be looking to create woodlands to offset corporate carbon, which, you know, it has a lot of benefits, but it's also squeezing land still further. At the same time, there's increased scrutiny in our food, where it comes from, how it's produced, all sorts of discussions going on around that. And I think people are increasingly caring more about how food's produced. So food production, sustainable food production, you know, in the UK is a really hot topic and something I think people really engage with. So agroforestry really offers us an interesting route to be addressing these issues. And frankly, final comment, we look forward to helping you to grow the agroforest for Cornwall. So big cheesy finale. Thanks ever so much everyone for coming. Thanks ever so much to our presenters, really appreciate your time. And thanks everyone for participating. And last time I'll say it, please check in with the Let's Talk platform to get future updates on what we're up to, and we'll hopefully see you on a farm walk before too long. Thanks ever so much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, Steph?
Yeah, all good. Still some people here, I think. I'll stop the recording now.